Tonight we're going to look at the parable of the dishonest manager, which I must tell you is one of my favorite parables. In part because it has some great twists. Also in part, there's not a big conclusion. We'll come to that in a minute. I like stories that have endings, but there are some stories I like where I get to end it. We can talk about how you all like that as well. So, as we're going to do in this series of parables, we're going to read these stories as stories. That's how Jesus told them. So we want to hear them as stories. Those of us, particularly who've read the Bible a long time and looked at it, we kind of look at it as a Sunday school lesson. It's not a bad thing, but I really want to emphasize for us to read it as stories and hear it as story. So, we'll do 4 things each week. One, we'll place the setting or frame the story. How does the gospel writer frame the story? All right? Or maybe how did Jesus frame the story in the way he told it? Okay? Tonight we'll do examples of both of those. Then we'll talk about the plot. Every great story has got a good plot. We'll look at the character development, although parables oftentimes don't have a development because they're very short. Don't have enough time to develop the characters. But we'll look at, do the characters play according to their type, to their stereotype, or are they different than their stereotype? Because if they're different, they're going to tell us a key thing in the story. And then finally, we're going to look at the end. What happens at the end? What's the moral of the story? Right? What's this mean to us? And what can we take to this? How can we apply this to our faith? Where does it fit that way? All right, there's the 4 things. So let's look at thinking about framing the story. So interesting, Luke just kind of tells a story after he's already told some other stories. There's not really anything on the outside that happens. Like last week when we did the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus and this lawyer, this teacher of the law, have this interchange, and their interchange sets up the story. Nothing like that this week. Luke tells stories in chapter 15 and then goes to another story. So let's think about the stories in chapter 15. Well, the story immediately preceding this one is the parable of the prodigal son. So, I'm curious, you all know the parable of the prodigal son. What do you think is the moral to the story of the prodigal son? What's the moral to the story of prodigal son? Anybody? One more time, David.
His father welcomed him home.
The father welcomed him home. Okay, despite what he had done, the father welcomed him home. All right, what else? I'm going to learn that sooner or later. What else?
Well, in like manner, Jesus would welcome us after we have obviously sinned against him.
Okay, so beyond the story itself, it imagines that God is also welcoming of us as well. So we're thinking about God's grace and God's forgiveness and God's mercy. This is what's going in our heads as we're listening to these stories being told. And as Jesus told the stories, people listened to them, and then Luke wrote these down. And in the early days of the church, people didn't have Bibles like this. Nobody had Bibles, right? You had maybe one manuscript in your church and somebody read that. So we want to think about the Bible. Even though we're used to reading the Bible, all these stories were listened to, which is key to how we understand the Bible. So they're listening to these stories, and so now they're thinking, before we get to the next story, they're thinking about God's grace and God's forgiveness and God's mercy. All right? So that's one of the ways this story is being framed. Now notice that in chapter 15 in Luke, there's 3 stories. Oops, wrong fingers. 3 stories, right? There's the parable of the lost sheep, there's the parable of the lost coin, and then there's the parable of the lost son, prodigal. Okay? So there's 3 stories about God's grace. In each case, what's lost is found, and there's a big celebration, right? Now, when you all tell stories, and you do it in threes, what does that typically mean? Okay, think about jokes. A guy goes into a bar, and it's a priest and a rabbi and whatever, right? There's always three, okay? We saw this even in last week's parable, right? A guy is left for dead on the side of the road, and first comes by a priest, and then comes by a Levite, and then comes by, and the other person is the kicker to the story, all right? So oftentimes we tell short stories, we use threes. We tell jokes or whatever, we want threes. If we're telling examples, if you listen to some preacher, she's going to give you 3 examples, right? Oftentimes, that's the way case we do. So Luke's already given us 3 tales about God's grace. So now we have a 4th story. So what's that mean? Well, maybe he's continuing on, or maybe this is a change to a new direction, right? Many times authors write trilogies to kind of make a longer tale and then they're done. Unless it's J.K. Rowling who realizes, hey, I'm making a lot of money, let's just keep doing Harry Potter as long as I can, right? So we don't know, in Luke's case, what's going on. So we're thinking about God's grace, but maybe he's continuing with this, or maybe he's changing course. So let's have an open mind to this story. And let's keep the prodigal son in the back of our minds, but let's have an open mind. Now, in this parable, Jesus himself also sets up the story with the first 2 verses. So let's read those 2 verses, and then we'll stop. Don't read ahead after that, okay? Then Jesus said to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, okay, 2 people. And charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So the rich man summoned the manager and said to him, what is this I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer. Well, now we have the story framed. It's in the tale. It's already set up for us. So let's think about, what do we have here? We have a manager that's been accused of squandering his boss's money. He's going to get fired. Now, in most of this series, I'm not going to have to pull off preacher talk or a lot of Bible stuff for you, because stories are just stories and we want to be able to hear them. But in this case, I need to do a little bit of work with you. The word charges in the Greek is a particular word that is also close to the word for devil in the Greek, which might mean that these charges are malicious or hostile charges, which raises a question. Did somebody, and the somebody is anonymous, right? We don't know who this somebody is. Somebody has tattletaled on this manager. And so it raises a question. We don't know who this person is. So now there's a question, what's going on? And now you know that these are devil charges, these are malicious charges, these are hostile charges. So are they true? Or are they made up by one of his enemies? But we don't know. There's a question there. So let's read this verse this way. There was a rich man who had a manager, and malicious charges were brought to him that his manager was squandering his property. All right, there's how Luke is framing the story. Let's see what you all think of this. Sticking to just these 2 verses, in what way is this manager like the prodigal son who we just finished hearing about? You see any similarities there?
Well, he's stolen from his master, just like the prodigal son took his inheritance and squandered it.
That's right. In fact, if you look back in chapter 15, the same word, squandered, is used in both situations. The prodigal son took his father's money, his inheritance, off, and he squandered it in a far country. And now this guy is accused of squandering his boss's money. Okay?
They both landed up in a bad place.
Say that again.
They both landed up in a bad place.
Yes, yes. Yeah, they're in a bad situation. That's right. The prodigal son had squandered all his money, and he was left with nothing and found himself feeding pigs, the lowest job a Jew could do at that time. And now this man is about to get fired. So, the squandering brings similar results. The rich man is firing the manager solely on these malicious charges that may or may not be true. Again, sticking to our 2-verse introduction, how does this make him similar or different from the loving father in the prodigal son?
All of a sudden, the money was his, and he got rid of it. In this situation, he's wasting the manager's money.
Okay, all right. And what about how does the rich man compare then to the father?
Well, the father forgave his son.
Okay.
This man's getting ready to fire him.
Okay. So in this way, they're a little bit different. Similar situation, somebody squanders somebody's money, but the loving father forgives, and this rich boss is ready to fire him. So maybe he's different in that way. Anything else we see or think?
Well, there's kind of an element of God's judgment.
Okay.
Because I think in the previous parables, God forgave.
Right.
This time, if you compare the rich man to God, he brings judgment.
Okay. So maybe there's a switch here. Yeah. So maybe Luke has finished his trilogy of Jesus' parables of grace and love, and now comes a twist. Now we're going to have a parable of judgment, possibly. Okay? We'll keep our minds open, but we may have to swing a switch here. Okay? Now I had a big arrow there. Why did I have that arrow? All right, I'll figure it out. So here we go. This story then is about some class warfare, isn't it? I mean, the boss is a 1%er. This guy has a big ranch. We can tell that because of the amounts that the farmers, the debtors, had. We know that this is a big ranch. And we assume he may be Jewish because nothing tells he's not. This is his manager, not his slave. So we're going to assume this is a rich Jewish person in the area. So he's a 1%er. He's driving around his BMW convertible, right? You can't trust those people, right? Don't look at my car too closely. This poor manager, whose charges, they've probably been trumped up, right? Nobody proved this. This is some unknown person. When someone gives you an unknown accusation, what goes off in your mind? Skepticism. And why, Dickie? Why are we skepticism about it?
We don't know what their motivation is.
Ah, that's right. If we know who it is, then we can think, okay, does this person have an axe to grind? Is this person usually trustworthy? But if it's an anonymous tip, we're like, what's going on? So this poor guy, hardworking guy, like all the Jewish peasants who are listening to Jesus, is a hardworking guy, and he is getting fired by an anonymous person who lied about him, and now his rich boss is firing him, just like those scoundrels always do, right? See what's going on here? We got the 1% against the 99%. Okay, this is the story. All this is going on, okay? What do you think the crowd? Now again, pretend. We can't do that perfectly because we're 21st century people. What do you think the first century crowd of Jewish peasants is thinking now about the rich man and the manager? Any guesses? Do they like the rich man?
Probably not.
Probably not. Do they like the manager?
He's one of them.
He's one of them. That's right. He's a regular Joe. And it looks like he's got some enemy that's trumped up some charges, and his boss has unfairly fired him. Notice the boss is firing him before he looks at the accounts. Right? Maybe he should have said, bring me your accounts and let's see how you're doing. Instead he says, bring me your accounts, settle things, because you're fired. So, there's the whole setting. Okay? In the back of our minds is God's grace, but maybe Luke's changing the direction because we've already had the trilogy, so maybe we're heading to judgment, but we're not sure. And we've got this rich guy who's a jerk, as those rich guys always are, and we've got this manager who's just like us, and he's being taken advantage of. All right. Let's see where the story goes. Verse 3. Then the manager said to himself, what will I do now that my master is taking the position away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm too ashamed to beg. I've decided what I'm going to do, so that when I'm dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes. So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, how much do you owe my master? He said, 100 jugs of olive oil. He said to him quickly, take your bill, make it 50. Then he asked another, and how much do you owe? He replied, 100 containers of wheat. He said to him, take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. All right. Let's look at the plot of the story. Remember, in a plot, we're going to look for the tension and we're going to look for the twist. The manager getting fired on these malicious charges. That's the setting. The tension comes in verse 3. He says he's not strong enough to dig, and he's too ashamed to beg. The problem in the setting, his impending unemployment, is exacerbated by his pride and his weakness. The manager is forced, or maybe we could use a different word here. We'll use forced for the minute. He's forced to come up with another plan for his future. His future is not to continue on as a manager. Got to be something else. So he comes up with an ingenious plan. His plan is to change the debt owed to his boss by these tenant farmers. Now, we don't know how many farmers there were. Notice in this situation, there's only 2 farmers mentioned, right? I just told you in telling a short story, 3 is the complete number. So 2 means they're still to be finished. Okay, we're still waiting for the priest and the rabbi came in the bar. We're still waiting for the third person to come through the bar. Okay, so there's more people than just these 2. The farmer who owes the landowner 100 jugs of olive oil now only owes the rancher 50 jugs of olive oil. The farmer who owes 100 bushels of wheat now only owes 80 bushels of wheat. So if you think about this, the way the tenant farmers worked, so they would be sharecroppers in a sense. Okay, not different system, but similar. So they would be given the seed for the land they're supposed to work, and by the seed, they would know that at the end of the harvest, you owe this much of harvest. And if you grow more than that, you keep that. Okay? You can sell it yourself. If you grow less of that, then we got problems. Or these also could have been merchants who would have taken the oil and the wheat to the marketplace. The landowner wouldn't have done that, right? The point of being rich, you let other people do stuff you don't want to do. So somebody else would have done that. And they would have known, okay, I'm responsible for these 100 jugs of oil, and when I come back, I got to have the money for 100 jugs of oil and a receipt, something like that, okay? And then I would get paid a portion of that. So something like that happened in this situation. The manager had the authority to change things. That's the point of the manager, okay? Annual contracts could be changed. If a drought starts happening, like we've had since, around the summertime here, and you just know, how many of y'all had Christmas trees that you bought that seemed really dry about a week after you bought them? I don't know about y'all, but ours was really dry this year, and we figure, well, the trees didn't have a lot of water, but they were dry when we got them. So in drought, not going to get all the crop you did. So the manager could change this on behalf of the farmer. Now the rancher could be a hard-nosed business person, but it's a society where people are stuck. Nobody's moving to Los Angeles, okay? The Beverly Hillbillies aren't leaving Tennessee for LA, all right? So you want to have good relations with the village. If there's a drought, you need to have your manager change the accounts. You need to be, that's how it works. Some of you all, if you've ever had small businesses, you want to make sure you keep your customers happy because they keep coming back. Similar kind of thing. So this manager had the right to change, expected to change the contracts from time to time. The farmers mentioned the story now have an unexpected gift, okay? And it could be a big gift. If your annual contract is supposed to be 100 jugs of oil, and now you only have to return the money for 80, you've been given a 20% increase, right? Or is it 25? I'm going back and forth, whichever. Anyways, one of those two numbers is really big. That's a lot of money for a peasant farmer, okay? That's a huge jump in their income. The one who had 50, that's an enormous increase. It's possible that these farmers were getting a couple of years or maybe several years of profit from this. And that's what the dishonest manager is counting on, right? Because if he gives them enough money and then says, look, I don't have any place to live for a while. Can I stay with you guys for a while? And they said, well, you just gave me 3 years worth of profit. Yeah, come on, you can have a bed for a while. That's what he's counting on, okay? Now, at this point, in the plot, we would expect the owner's wrath, right? He's been cheated out of a bunch of money, okay? He's got a big bank account. It's not as big to him as the farmers, but it's still a lot of money. He's been swindled. He's been played for the fool, right? He can't go back on the manager's word because that's what managers do. You don't want people in the village to find that this guy reneges on his word. You can't trust this guy. He has his managers tell you one thing, and then they do something else, and then he goes back on it. Okay, your word is your bond in the village. So he can't go back on it. The other thing is, what do you think the farmer who owed the oil and the farmer who owed the wheat, what do they think of the rancher right now? They don't know the background stuff. They think this guy's great. They think he's turned a new leaf. They thought before he drew a hard bargain, but maybe he's turned a new leaf. Maybe he was sick in July and got well, and God's told him, you need to be more generous with people. Whatever it is, they are happy. They are loving this guy. They're thinking, man, it's going to be great in the years ahead, right? Well, if you're the rich owner and you have all these people thinking you're just the best guy in the world, you can't go back and say, well, that scoundrel changed things. So he knows he's stuck. We might think he's ready to play hardball on this manager. At first, he was going to fire him. Maybe now he's going to do more than that. we expect him to play vengeance, to play hardball. And if he does that, the crowd will hate him even more. But instead, he commends the manager for his shrewdness. There's the twist in the plot. The rich, hardball owner suddenly accepts the generosity he gets blamed for, and he appreciates the shrewdness of the guy who's cheated him out of money. And the plot twist ends the story. All right, let's think about this tale for a little bit. Think about the tale. The business owner, I think, makes a huge mistake in the plot. And it's similar to the father in the prodigal son. What's the mistake he makes? What's the mistake the loving father makes in the story? Early in the story.
Because it gives the son the inheritance.
Yes. Now, if one of your children says to you, Mom, Dad, I wish you were dead, would you give me my inheritance now? What would y'all do? Well, I could give you an inheritance because I just wrote you out of my will. You get nothing. That's what we would do, right? But the father makes a mistake. He goes ahead and gives the son his inheritance. What does the owner do that's a mistake? Even before that, Aubrey, in the story. Think back earlier in the story. He fires him before he settles the accounts. He says, you're fired. Now go get my books and come back and we'll settle things up. That was his big mistake. He almost does the same thing the loving father does. He goes ahead and gives the man the book, which is money. The book is money, right? He gives it to him, and he's already told him what he's going to do to him. So there's this interesting mistake in the plot. Now, the manager was maliciously charged with squandering his boss's money. We don't know if the charges are true or not. It's just wondering in our mouth. We're skeptical, as Dickie said, because it was anonymous. But we do know what he did next, right? And what does he do next? Yeah, he squanders his money, right? We don't know if he's a scoundrel. We don't know it or not. It's possibly accused of that. But regardless, he then proves his accuser right. This is a guy who's a scoundrel. This is a guy who will steal from his boss. Because we see it in the story. He becomes what he's accused of being. So again, we don't know if he was accused properly or not. But now we're thinking, well, maybe it was right. Because the first thing he thinks to do is to steal from his boss. He becomes who they said he was. All right, let's go to the third movie. Let's think about the characters. Remember, in a short story, we want the characters to play the part that we expect them to play, to live according to stereotypes. Now, treating people like stereotypes is not a good thing in life, but it's okay in stories, okay? We'll keep those boundaries there. Again, I want you to keep thinking of yourself as a Jewish peasant in the first century. We began with this rich guy who fires the regular guy without giving him an honest hearing. So the crowd hates the rich guy, and they have sympathy for the manager. But then the manager makes a confession. What's his confession? He says to himself, I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm too proud to beg. Now, this is a startling confession, right? The audience, it's a bunch of regular people, hardworking people, peasants. And this guy's confession is, I'm too weak to dig, and I'm too proud to beg. If you are a Jewish peasant in the first century, and you hear this guy's confession, what are you thinking about this guy now? He's arrogant. That's right. What else are we thinking? He's lazy. He's lazy and he's arrogant. Now, at first, we had sympathy for the guy, right? He's a regular guy, trumped up charges. Now, what are we thinking about the guy?
Dishonest, but now he sounds honest.
Yeah. What else?
He could dig if he wanted to.
He could if he wanted to. That's right. That's right. We had, I won't go deep. We had to put our dog down Friday night. 17-year-old dog, beloved family pet, and one of my daughters helped me dig her grave. Well, you ever dug down 3 feet of clay soil? I'm thankful for Abby helping me, but she didn't get that big of chunks in her shovel. But she did anyways, right, Lanny? She did anyways. So even if you're weak, you can dig a little bit. You can do a little bit of hard work, okay? But this guy was lazy. So now we're thinking, okay, we like this guy, but now we're not sure. This guy doesn't have any armor. Peasants are hardworking. You have to be to survive. He's too proud to beg, which maybe you don't want to be beggars because we're hardworking people, but if he had a wife and child at home, he better be doing something. If the last thing he can do is beg. You got to feed your kids. But too weak to dig? No, as Lanny said, you can at least dig a little bit in your shovel. So this guy is shameful. Now, the other character in the story is the rich man. He's got some surprises too. We expected him to be angry, to play hardball once he realizes he's been made a fool and been cheated out of a bunch of money. Instead, he goes ahead, as far as we can tell, and lets the farmers keep the money that the manager had given them, and then he commends the dishonest manager. Now, if you're a first century peasant, what are you thinking about the rich guy?
Nice guy.
He might be a nice guy. Maybe I misjudged him. Anything else? He's trying to get along, so maybe we have some hope here for the future, yeah. So now our opinions about both these persons are changing in the story. As Jesus likes to do a lot of stories.
They probably figured he was charging 2 minutes to begin with.
That's right. We finally got an honest deal with this guy. Okay, that's right. That's a great one, David. So these feelings are changing about these characters. So by the end of the story, the good guy, the manager, is bad, and the bad guy, the 1%er, is good. Curious thing with this parable, Jesus doesn't tell us how it ended. Partially, do you think the manager kept his job? If you think he kept his job, raise your hand. Well, I know we don't know. We're just going to guess. What do you think? You think he's already said he commends him. Do you think he keeps his job? All right, we got a few for that. Okay, how many think he's still going to get fired? All right. Okay, we're split. All right.
Changed his mind to get along with the guy that gave back.
Yep.
So he's agreeing with the guy now, so he's going to try to keep the guy happy.
He might change his mind again.
He might keep him a week and get rid of him.
Let this blow over and then do it. That's right. All right. How do y'all want to finish the tale? How would any of y'all finish the tale?
He negotiated a contract with the manager to get his money back in the future.
Okay. All right. That's how Kevin would finish it.
Shrewdness.
All right. Shrewdness begets shrewdness. Somebody else. How would you finish the tale?
Don't let him lose his job.
Oh, go ahead, Lanny, and I'll come up. Go ahead, Mac.
His job, if he does it again, he's gone.
Okay, he keeps his job, but I'm keeping my eyes on you now. I'm watching you now like a hawk. Yeah, yeah. What else?
Me and my wife and child, we're going to stay with these people, and we gave all this stuff out. In the meantime, I'm going to be looking for a job. It ain't going to be digging. It ain't going to be begging, but I'm going to look for a job.
Got to have my resume out.
Yeah, give me a rep, but I'm going to be staying with these people that I gave all this stuff out.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. You might get some extra meals that way.
That's right. It ain't work.
But it didn't,
Missy, go ahead.
it didn't sound like to me that the manager was liked anyway because he
Uh-huh.
was concerned what he was going to do.
Yes.
He wasn't nice to these farmers. They
Ah.
were going to be nice to him when he lost his job.
Ooh, that's a great insight, Missy, to the story.
That's the way I read it, because he was like, I need to do something to look good in their eyes so they'll help take care of me.
Right. That's great. That's a great.
So when the master or the rich man comes back through, are the farmers going to know who was the one that cut the deal with them? Was it?
Uh-huh.
Did he give him the direction to cut the deal, or did the manager cut the deal without the rich man knowing so that he would look good? So I mean, it'd be kind of confusing then where that direction came.
Right.
The master takes credit.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, of course. So he's the landowner. He gets all the credit. Yeah.
Do that.
Yeah. I love that, Izzy. I have never thought about that. That is a great. Next time I teach this lesson, I'm going to add that to it. And of course, he is accused anonymously, which means at least one person didn't like him. Okay? Yeah. That's great. I love that, Missy. Who else? How would you end the story?
In today's time, we would call it a whistleblower.
Ah, yeah, that's right. He had an anonymous whistleblower. Yep. Well, I think you don't have to. You can think about this some more. I think it's fascinating that Jesus did not end the parable and left it open-ended, but he just did that with the prodigal son, didn't he? What's open-ended there?
Well, you never know what the prodigal son, if he was allowed to stay, or if he, when his father did die, did he get some more inheritance?
True, we don't know that, but we do know he was in the store in the party. There's another character in the prodigal son that's completely open-ended. The older brother. The father goes out to meet him, and he tells him his spiel, and then the father goes back in the party, and we don't know, does the older brother finally go into the party, or does he stay outside and sulk? So back to back, we got two parables where Jesus leaves us open, and then we get to finish the tale. We'll all do our finishing. When we do the prodigal son in a few weeks, we'll ask for y'all to finish it. So there's your teaser for the future. Well, let's go to the moral of the story. And this is fascinating. So let's go back to read the second half of verse 8 through 13. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in very little is faithful also in much. And whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with dishonest wealth, who will entrust you with true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. All right, I want to get y'all's honest opinions about this. When we got to the end of the parable, and I was asking you how would you end it and so forth, how many of y'all are a little confused about what the point of the parable was? Anybody confused about it? Well, let me in y'all secret. You're not alone. Luke was clearly confused about what the meaning of the parable was. Because we just read 5 different summation statements of the parable. It's like Luke was like, what was Jesus saying in this parable? What did he mean by this parable? And it's like, well, I'm not really sure. So let me list 5 possibilities, right? Isn't that what he does? It's like 5. Those are each 5 proverbs that you have to wrestle with. But it's hard to know which of those is the right one. Is the right one that the children of this age are more shrewd than the children of light? Is that the meaning of the parable? Or is it make friends for yourselves by dishonest gain so that you may be welcomed into eternal homes? Is that the meaning? Or is it whoever is faithful with a little bit is faithful with much? Maybe that's the meaning. Or is it if you have not been faithful with dishonest wealth, who will trust you with true riches? Or maybe it's no slave can serve 2 masters. You cannot serve God and wealth. I just think it's fascinating that Luke is scratching his head when he's putting together his gospel. That's what he says he's did at the beginning of the gospel. And he kind of puts multiple choice and says, y'all pick. Now, what do y'all think about that? That Luke kind of lists all these for us to figure out what's the point of the story. Say it again, Kevin.
He meant them all the above.
Maybe meant them all. Some of them are a little bit contradictory, though.
This guy's walking with Jesus every day. And what does that say about us? We're not even there. We're not in the picture. How do you make out what all this is all about?
Right. Yeah, I take a little bit of comfort in this because sometimes it's hard for me to figure out what Jesus wants me to do. So I'll keep wrestling with it. I'll keep trying. I'll keep listening. But I won't feel too bad when I don't always know what the answer is. Sometimes I don't know what the answer is. And this is an example that even the biblical writers didn't know what the answer was. So I'll just leave that with y'all for you to wrestle. So not only is the parable doesn't have an ending, but Luke couldn't figure out what the point of the story was. I do want to say, however, that we can think of the story this way. This is a story about a manager who becomes like the charges against him. They said he squandered the money. In the end, he did squander money. And the owner becomes like the contract changes the manager does in his name. The owner, who people will assume is a hard bargain, shouldn't like him, becomes somebody who is generous. So both characters in the story become what the story happens to them. We begin with a rich man who fires an employee without giving him a chance to defend himself. And we end the story with farmers who receive several years' work as a bonus from the generosity of a business owner who sticks by his shrewd manager's actions. And a manager who, I think, saves his job or at least receives a personal commendation by being dishonest. And a rich man, once hated, who becomes a generous hero. Harshness and dishonesty are turned into generosity and grace. It's like the kingdom of God came to earth. That is an amazing tale. But we're not done. There is an epilogue to the story. So, open your Bibles back up. Verse 14. The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all this. It's an important phrase, lovers of money. And this is a story about money. And they ridiculed Jesus. So he said to them, "You are those who justify yourselves in the sight of others. But God knows your hearts. For what is prized by human beings is an abomination in the sight of God." That's a great epilogue. The religious establishment didn't like this parable. So if you don't like this parable, think of your company. Maybe we better wrestle with it a little bit longer. And Jesus rebukes those who don't like the parable, saying, you are those who justify yourselves in the sight of others, but God knows your hearts. I kind of wish Luke would have put that part up earlier when the parable was done, because I think that might be a better way to hear the story. Does God know the hearts of the rich man and his dishonest manager better than their cover says they are? Maybe there's more to meet the eye with these two than what we first thought. Well, I'm going to leave it open, because if Jesus could leave this thing open, I'll leave it open as well. Anybody got a last thought? I like that, Lanny. Yep. What else? Any other last thoughts? Well, I hope y'all have had fun this evening, and I hope also maybe it stirred your heart a little bit to love the Word of God a little bit more. Let me have a prayer just to end us with. Dear gracious God, we thank you for your Word. Your Spirit is deep in these words, and we ask, in reading them in a fresh way, we would hear your voice to us. And even when it's hard to figure out, you would show us how to live in this world as your disciples. In Christ we pray. Amen. Thank you all.